Hello and welcome to this presentation on research governance. I'm Jennifer Berger and I'm one of the Making Research Happen managers at the Health Determinants Research Collaboration South Tees. In this presentation, I'm going to be covering what research governance is, where it came from, so a bit of its history, why it's important and how it can support you. So whether you're totally new to research or you've already have experience conducting research, this presentation will hopefully support you to build a better understanding of research governance. So if you have some research experience, you've likely come across words like ethics, integrity, and governance. And often, and perhaps confusingly, they're used interchangeably in research. But it's important to note that they are, in fact, distinct. So research integrity can be understood as the character and traits of the researchers. And this includes things like honesty, so being honest about how you plan to conduct the research and the methods you're using. Being respectful, so treating participants, colleagues, and other researchers with respect. Acting with rigor, so using appropriate methods, drawing conclusions, and disseminating results. Being transparent, so being open about your research and, of course, declaring any conflict of interest. And finally, being accountable to the participants and holding individuals or organisations to account when necessary. Researchers have an individual responsibility and care for participants and how they conduct research, and that's research integrity. And it's really important because it ensures trustworthiness, accuracy, and the reliability of research findings. And this is different to research ethics, which is focused on judgments on the ethical acceptability of research and should primarily be the responsibility of research ethics committees. It also often includes input from the public as well as the research community. So while research integrity is the responsibility of the individual researcher or researchers, research ethics is the responsibility of a committee and potentially others as well. Research ethics is essential as it protects participants' safety and dignity and ensures data integrity and fosters public trust. Research governance, on the other hand, is primarily focused on the various means through which we manage and regulate research. These means include policies, processes, committees, officers, and organisations. So while research integrity is the responsibility of the individual researchers and the research ethics is the responsibility of the research ethics committees, research governance is primarily the responsibility of research support officers. And this is, of course, just a brief overview of what research integrity, research ethics, and research governance entail. And you could probably see why they are often used interchangeably because they are very important to each other in ensuring research is conducted in a robust and ethical way. But what they entail and who is involved is quite different, which is why, for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on research governance. So we can begin to build an understanding of why research governance is important. I thought I'd share with you why it was introduced in the first place. So research governance isn't new. In response to the atrocities committed by physicians under the Nazi regime who carried out unethical medical research on human subjects during the Second World War, the World Medical Association developed the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964. The Declaration of Helsinki was the first document of its kind, and it guides physicians and researchers to prioritise patient health, safety, and rights above scientific interests, incorporating informed consent and independent ethical review. And although it was not a legally binding document, its principles have since been widely adopted into national legislation, regulations, and research ethics guidelines globally. Since the declaration was developed by the World Medical Association, it has been revised numerous times to reflect our growing understanding of how research involving human subjects should be conducted. The Declaration of Helsinki was a cornerstone document as it effectively challenged old ways of working by highlighting the importance of protecting participant well-being and health, protecting vulnerable groups, and making sure there's actually a scientific basis for the research and that there's a thorough understanding of the literature before research is carried out so that any risks to participants are identified before conducting the research. More recent revisions of the Declaration of Helsinki, especially 2000 and later, have strengthened protections for privacy and data confidentiality, which is really important as this helps to prevent data breaches, ensures participant privacy, and also protect the reputation of researchers and institutions. So hopefully this slide has given you a bit of an overview of the Declaration of Helsinki and its more recent iterations and how it has shaped how we conduct research today. So why does research governance matter to me, or why should it matter to you? We know that evidence-based decision making is really important as it replaces intuition and bias with reliable data, which significantly increases the likelihood of successful outcomes. And evidence is gathered through research. It doesn't really matter what context you're working in. If you want to test a new idea, theory, or new intervention, which will produce new knowledge or data, or if you want to provide a new interpretation of existing information, so for example, this could be routinely collected data being used for a new purpose or publicly available data, then this involves conducting research. And research governance is really important when getting to plan and manage your research. So while research governance can be seen as quite a dry topic and it might even be seen as something you have to do rather than you want to do, it is ultimately there to support you. It might get you to answer important questions that you hadn't thought of, and it'll guide you through the approvals that you need to have in place and the policies that you need to comply with before carrying out the research. This ensures that you have everything in place before research is carried out so that you're not having to worry about it at a later date. Importantly, research governance also allows organisations to regulate and have oversight of research that their employees are conducting. For example, a benefit of having research governance in place from an organisational standpoint is that it can save money. Organisations can make sure that if someone has a research question, that research hasn't already been carried out, so it helps to avoid unnecessary duplication. It also helps to avoid any reputational damage to the organisation by making sure that only researchers demonstrating appropriate track records are carrying out research and that the appropriate insurances and indemnity arrangements are in place. So, research governance is certainly something that organisations or people wanting to conduct research should be thinking about. So, if you're going to be spending time undertaking research, you obviously want that research to be useful and inform the way that people work. And research governance gets you to think about things like, is this research needed? Has it been done before? As well as all the approvals you need to have in place to make sure that the research is robust and will add value. Although it's not usual, published research can be retracted, especially if it's found that the researchers have, for example, done things like use questionable research practices. They haven't declared a conflict of interest, or they've ignored data, or inappropriate methods have been used. Bad research behaviours vary in severity, and some things might simply be a researcher oversight. It may just be something that they didn't think about prior to conducting the research. However, the consequence of poorly managed research is research waste. So in 2009, it was estimated that as much as 85% of research is wasted, which is a huge amount. And in 2014, MacLeod came up with 5 areas of research waste, and some points that were included were poorly designed research, not being aware of existing studies in the field, and biased reporting. So I just wanted to include this well-known quote from Altman in 1994, which says, "Less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons." And this is why research governance is vital, as it helps to reduce research waste by establishing a framework of standards, accountability, and monitoring that ensures that research is scientifically sound, ethical, and necessary. So, where do research governance frameworks fit with research governance? So, research governance is the overarching principles, regulations, and standards to ensure research quality. A research governance framework is a specific formal policy document outlining the standards and procedures for implementing this governance. So, in short, governance is the goal and function, and the framework is the documented guidance. Now, there's certainly no one size fits all when it comes to research governance frameworks. Organisations often have their own research governance frameworks and related policy documents. However, it's important to note that in some circumstances, you'll have to go through an external process to get the right approvals. And I've put a couple of examples where you'll have to go through an external process on the slide. So on this slide, you're looking at part of a research governance framework that the UK IO use. As you can see, the form asks questions about the planning of the research. This part of the framework has tick boxes, and this checklist approach is extremely common. And it's also quite common to have some free text boxes where you can write in your answers and provide more detail to certain questions. Research governance frameworks often have different stages too. So, for example, you'd fill out the first stage, that would be approved if everything was okay with that, and then you'd move on to the next stage. And this means that if there is an issue, this can be identified sooner rather than later, so that you're not having to spend a lot of time filling in a lot of information in one go for it then to be potentially rejected because there was an issue with the research question at conception. Perhaps the research has already been done and you weren't aware of it. So the forms are a space where you can answer questions about your research, and it may prompt you to think about something that you hadn't thought of, as well as bring to your organisation's attention areas where you might need more support or where you might need to think a bit more carefully about. It will also provide information or links to relevant policy documents. As said at the start of the presentation, research governance is not the same as research ethics, so you'd still need to apply for ethical approval. But if you collaborate with an external organisation or institution on research, for example, you may be an LA colleague working with a university academic on research, then you can go through the university ethics process. However, while the two aren't the same, final governance approval does take into consideration the ethics opinion. So thank you for listening. I hope you found this presentation on research governance useful. If you want to do some further reading on research governance, I've included some information, some of the sources I consulted when making this presentation. So once again, thank you for listening.